Okay, it's time to talk about a topic which is, in a sense, very overdue. Um, Mentally, I refer to it as the value theory. I need to come up with some kind of name for the theory that it is. Um, um, as the sort of working title suggests, it is a value theory. Um, and really, so in other words, it's a theory or an account of valuation, and specifically, it's my sort of my best understanding of valuation as self-identification, um, and where it really came from is in meditating on the Euthyphro dilemma, which is sort of an episode in one of the Socratic dialogues written by Plato, in which Socrates speaks to a young man full of zeal for serving the gods. And Socrates asks this young man, Euthyphro, whether the gods love what is good because it's good, or is what's good good because the gods love it. This is a wonderful question, because one can see that it applies to more than the ethical or the meta-ethical. I mean, it applies to any instance of valuation. So to axiology or value theory, to aesthetics. Really, they can all be grouped under a kind of broad understanding of axiology, or if one wants to use the prefix meta a lot, meta-axiology. Um, and so um, this is a question of whether beauty is in the object or whether it's in the eye of the beholder. And on some level, all wise people have known that the answer is just yes. But the question is why? Or what's the sort of, if you will, technical resolution of the Euthyphro dilemma? Um, Theoretically, one would find it at some point where the objective and the subjective necessarily coincide, i.e., at that point of ultimate reality, for which you would benefit. You if you're talking about ultimate reality, you could do worse than looking at Christopher Langan's CTMU, and in which he treats of ultimate reality as some kind of definitionally necessary, for lack of a better term, entity. It's necessarily, by definition, all that is, and it is a se, or of itself, and self-existent. Um, and Christopher Langan treats of ultimate reality as a self-configuring, self-processing language. Which certainly functions in a mind-like way. It is a mind or consciousness, and God is the answer that we give in response to the question of whose mind or whose consciousness. So this mind that is ase, that is all that is, it bears description as solipsistic, or subject to a kind of solipsism. Outside it, there is no other reality. And also, you can see as an entailment of its aseity, it's sort of holographic in nature. The word Langan uses is hological. That is to say, all of its components or contents are sort of iridescently in the nature of the whole. So Langan speaks of sort of subsystems within the ultimate reality as being subject to a kind of distributed solipsism. There is a kind of quasi-solipsism that's the case for us. From our point of view, at least, we are all that exists. Even though for solipsism to truly apply to you, you would have to meet all the definitional requirements of the ultimate reality, which include omnipotence and omniscience, which you sort of don't. But it is acknowledging the very real sort of experiential sense in which, as far as you yourself are concerned, there is that very inescapable sense in which you are all that you exist, that exists because you are all that you will ever experience. Although again, there are wrinkles to that, because when we ask what the ultimate reality is, it is a sort of both and, which is beneath binary logic. Again, in Langanian language, this is because of a principle that he calls syndiphionesis. This is not so different from Hegel's sort of understanding of the identity of identity and difference. And namely, it's the idea that for any distinction, there is presupposed a kind of underlying identity. And when you get to the most generic distinction that is possible, just X or not X, it's like, this is the principle of non-contradiction, and it's as generic as it gets. The only thing that's even more generic than that, so as to serve as the basis underpinning the distinction, is necessarily something in the nature of both X and not X. But the thing about it is that it functions as a kind of dynamic contradiction. So in other words, it's both X and not X, but not, as it were, not at the same time. That's what the time-like dimension is for. It's X and then it's not X. Or put another way, the way that it really works out is it's self and other. And there's another way where what this comes down to, at least a surface reading of Langan suggests that what he's talking about is a kind of pure idealism that is always in an, I would say that is always in an immanent or containing mode. But really, I think the best understanding of what he's talking about is something which acknowledges a fundamentally dialectical dynamic that involves an interplay between idealism and realism, an interplay between a mode of integration or union and then a subsequent mode of differentiation in which knower and known, self and other, come together, but so that, they come together in a purely intrinsic way, but for purely intrinsic reasons, let's say, and they come apart thereafter, but only for the sake of a deeper, richer reintegration. Because there's a sense in which they already know all that there is to be known about the other, right? And to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. So there's a kind of further up, further in dynamic to all this. And it looks like self and other meeting, or a sort of state of affairs in which a consciousness is alternately identified with the contents of its consciousness and then distinguished from the contents of its consciousness, standing apart, distinct from the contents of its consciousness. And this I see as the relationship between essentially God and his creatures. He's uniting with his creatures in knowledge and love. It's sort of that love is the kind of itself the unity of the final unity of ontology and epistemology. And then he is sort of, if you will, recreating. There's a differentiative phase in which sort of a new creation stands apart from God, and he enters into it as into an unknown other. And the same dynamic really exists between us and God. There's a point here where I brought up Langan treating of ultimate reality as a self-configuring, self-processing language because love should be understood in this context as the self-recognition function of the infinite. So, and you see this in Genesis, like God creates something in his image and calls it good. It's like, was it good because it was in his image, or was it in his image because it was good, kind of thing. Well, I think from God's point of view, as it were, what you would say is that he loves it because it's good. or it's in his image because, or excuse me, it's good because it's in his image, something like that. Yeah, he creates it in his image, therefore it's good. Um, and so at the point where God is looking at his imager, there's the question of, is this a matter of, is this recognition, this identity, is it something that exists in the eye of the beholder, or is it a function of the object being beheld? And the answer is yes, because this is ultimate reality's self-recognition. It's meeting the criteria for both of those descriptors or properties. But now, because of the kind of, let's say, distributed solipsism, there's a way in which all our valuation sort of functions in the same way. And what we desire is, in a certain sense, our image of God, but it's also, in another sense, necessarily just, you might say, our image of ourselves. Because we sort of understand that we ourselves are also infinite in the way that, like God, dynamically or in motion, we are both X and not X. The nature of consciousness is itself more liquid, than liquidity, which is distinguished from solidity, and then whatever is underpinning that distinction is sort of more liquid than liquid in a sense. We apprehend ourselves as infinite on some level, and yet at the same time, because our experience is restricted to what we have experienced, there's a certain way in which we're seeking after our own highest conception of the infinite, but that conception is still only ever just a conception. But as far as what the infinite looks like, what a conception of the infinite looks like is, it looks like an integration of differentiated parts, which is transcendent and held to be valuable insofar as it overcomes a limit. And I would submit that with a little creativity, you can see pretty much every good thing as satisfying this description. And there's a way where a lot of the time what's good is sort of born of need. So in other words, is its goodness in the thing, or is it in the eye of the beholder? Well, kind of both and. There's a way that pattern and instance and pattern feed back on each other, mutually define each other. That's a thread that runs through all of Langen's work, and it's in some way you might even say it's the defining thread. So food on some level, it's an integration of differentiated parts. It's like it's cooked food, it's done just right, it has nutritive value. Not everything that you find and put into your mouth is going to have nutritive value. So it's integrating a lot of differentiated stuff, and thereby it's allowing one to overcome some limit of hunger, let's say. It's overcoming the limit or condition of lacking nutrition, let's say. Okay, so if I recall correctly, where I was last was using the example of a hamburger to illustrate the nature of desire, namely as a sort of mental striving toward something which partakes of the same nature as the infinite, inasmuch as it represents an integration of differentiated parts such that a limit is able to be overcome through it. Now, obviously, a hamburger doesn't represent the highest conception of the good of which one is capable. But I think the example does illustrate how the choice that we make in a given moment of choice reflects, so to speak, the highest good that is available for us to choose in that moment. In other words, we chose the hamburger because it was a better approximation, let's say, of the infinite than a hot dog was, which was also an option theoretically. We choose the highest conception of a good that is available for us to choose at the time as an option, and also there's a limit in effect. Namely, there's another limit in effect, which is how high a conception of the infinite are we actually able to form. But the nature of decision theory and value theory are such that we do choose the highest good that we are able to see and actually choose at a given time. But obviously, if you gave someone a genie lamp and told them to wish for whatever they wanted, they might wish to be a rock star who's got lots of money to share with their friends and family. And so you'll see there's a kind of self-actualization that's reached for there. And you see the overall thing looks like a kind of harmony. It looks like a harmony of harmonies, because as a rock star, he is one who creates harmonies, and he creates the sort of ideal order of things for his friends and family, and they look to him and he looks to them, for friendship, comfort, inspiration. It's like they see their identity in him and he sees his identity in theirs, and there's a kind of Droste effect here through which worlds are created. All right. So, but then again, you see the nature of the desire is such that when a person gets what they want, they desired it as an approximation or a conception of the infinite, essentially. But when you get it, it becomes all too finite. There's a sort of dialectical nature to desire for that reason. Because what one desires is a sort of a conception of the infinite, there's a way that dialectically desire is insatiable, and what is achieved becomes finite, and the sort of foil or backdrop against which some new object of desire is set off. To put it another way, it's like once you've eaten, that creates a new condition of lack. Like it's like I lack the facility to use the restroom or something, and you have to go and satisfy that desire and so forth. So we see from the insatiability of desire that the kind of horizon of intentionality is like both X and not X. So this is sounding very much like David Bentley Hart. And in some sense, it's also only because the horizon of intentionality is both X and not X that you're able to desire any particular finite thing at all. See, that's very much like David Bentley Hart. And not only that, it's also showing that the limit toward which desires tend, the ultimate thing that one desires, so to speak, is the conception of the unlimited as such, which is such an unlimited conception of the unlimited that, on some level, it's not even just like a second order predication of limitlessness. It's like, it's not simply saying that this is something such that the only limit we may place on it is the second order limit, that on the first order of predication there be no limits. It's more unlimited than that. So it's like, wow, okay, so because that's even a second order predication of limitation. So this is something that shouldn't even have that, which means, that in realizing that one has essentially discovered that one has placed a third order limitation on it of illimitability, and so on. So you see there's the Hegelian thing of to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit, and it all very much resembles the kind of dialectical nature of the infinite itself, where you have your conception of finitude against which the infinite is set off, but then any distinction presupposes an underlying identity, and therefore the true infinite is whatever's beneath the finite, and what is revealed to be merely your conception of the infinite. But see, given the dialectical interplay between realism and idealism, I would suggest that, at that moment where one is apprehending a still deeper infinite, that's not merely one's concept. That is one's coming into contact with sort of a genuine other. At the level of ultimate reality, that's the generative nature of ultimate reality. Something new and other coming into being. Okay, so, what the nature of desire is revealing is that in the limit, we desire God. And that's that whole classical theism thing of sort of God being God is what is truly desired in every, desire or operation, be it, a physical or purely mental striving or reaching towards some goal. That goal is always God. And however defective our attempts to realize that goal or conceive of God may be, God is nonetheless the true object of every desire that we form or are capable of forming. Now we can interestingly ask, what does God desire? God understood not just as consciousness as such, which weirdly, consciousness as such, both X and not X, is also like the limit of consciousness, because both X and not X is like the thing that there is nothing that it's like to be. So it is consciousness as such. In other words, it's what consciousness is dynamically, but it's also weirdly the limit of consciousness, which is how you know that it's the ultimate reality on some level, because the ultimate reality functions as its own complement or backdrop or negation. The true infinite has no negation or no opposite, or that is to say, it's its own negation or opposite. So where God is understood not just as consciousness as such, but also as a consciousness, God is consciousness and a consciousness. In other words, God as the sort of the consciousness of the universe, assuming the universe has a consciousness. And if you don't assume it has a consciousness, then just humor me and assume we're talking about what the consciousness of the universe would be like if the universe had a consciousness, even if you think the universe just happens to be a zombie, right? You can still talk about the kind of consciousness that a zombie would have if it were conscious. So just humor me. But of course I think God is both consciousness and a consciousness. He is the consciousness of all that is in any currently existing sense. And that's the dynamic between the Father and the Son, if you ask me, as far as my Trinitarian theology goes. So what is this logos, this universal consciousness desire? Because whatever it desires is teleology. And again, consider the unlimited nature of desire, or consider the nature of desire as toward what is unlimited, right? What transcends a limit. And also consider the hological nature of ultimate reality, being a se, having only itself on which to draw for any sort of mereological or compositional resources. It's like any fraction or component it might have is also in the nature of the whole. So we're all in the image of God, and given the Euthyphro dilemma resolving nature of desire, God desires what is in his image. In other words, everyone who has any being lives and moves and has his being in God, and anyone who's in God is in the image of God, and that means God desires all of them. And so the most limitless desire that God can conceive is union and reconciliation with all of his imagers. It is not a sufficiently infinite desire for him to only desire a union with some of his imagers. The nature of desire itself is restlessly striving toward that which overcomes all limitation as such, the highest conception of the unlimited that can be formed. So you can see there's a teleological argument here from the nature of desire itself for universal reconciliation. Because, people can at me for being a universalist, but what I'm suggesting is that God is a universalist too. And put it another way, if it's a creature's if it's only a creature's will that thwarts God from achieving his desire, remember that the creature's will can in the limit only be toward God on our end, for our part, right? So there's a definite mutuality here, or again, if you like, an interdefinitionality, an dependence between pattern and instance and pattern, creator and creature and creator. And it all points toward universal reconciliation. So, you thought you were getting electron value theory and stuff, but then I snuck in my own, what's that word? Where you get on a soapbox? I snuck in my own kind of ranting and soapboxing about the kind of stuff that I always, rant about. Yeah, it's almost as if, the person delivering this lecture once, had a whole podcast called Universalism Against the World, or as it should have been called, Universalism Against the Whole Entire Rest of the Universe. But again, once again, y'all can at me, but guess what? God is a universalist. And that's teleology. That's just the way the teleological cookie crumbles, baby. Did all of those words come out right? That's just the way that the teleological cookie crumbles. I think that's what I said. Anyway, I'll know it on playback. All right. Well, thank you for listening. I think that covers all of it for now, as far as like the nature of desire and all that. I think I explained my value theory reasonably well in that. Hopefully, maybe, we'll see. All right. Peace.